So President-elect Joe Biden is set to name Gary Gensler as chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, that according to sources that are close to the administration.
And a former Goldman Sachs banker, professor at MIT, said to have a good understanding of a lot going on there. So senior reporter at the Huffington Post, Zach Carter, he's joining us now to discuss Biden's recent pick. Good to see you, Zach. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. So just give us your reaction generally to this pick. Place it in the context of how you expect Biden to approach not just widespread macroeconomic issues, but actual regulation of financial markets as we continue.
I think this is great news for the Biden administration's approach to economic management. The competition wasn't particularly stiff, but Gary Gensler was easily the best bank regulator in the Obama administration. He worked at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is a relatively obscure but very powerful agency that regulates derivatives. And derivatives are those crazy contracts that were at the heart of the 2008 financial crisis. So it was a big job trying to clean up the derivatives market, and he got a lot of flack from Wall Street, and he, unlike just about everybody else in the administration, he didn't cater to Wall Street. He actually stood up to them and implemented some pretty good rules. So I think having him at the SEC means the SEC will actually do something. You know, for about really 25, 30 years, the SEC has been an almost, I won't say useless agency, because it's still good that corporations have to disclose things, but the SEC is just not a particularly powerful agency. It doesn't enforce the law very effectively. And just in terms of pure enforcement, having someone like Gensler there who believes that big corporations have to play by the rules, I think is good news. Mm-hmm. I think it also suggests politically, Biden has learned some of the lessons from the Obama administration. You know, to my mind, on economic policy, the Obama administration's two really big screw-ups were on financial policy and then on fiscal policy. They undershot on the economic stimulus package when they came into office, and then sort of turned to austerity beginning in about 2010, which I think was a terrible mistake. And then they really gave the country the impression that the rich play by different rules by not prosecuting bankers who were, had pretty clearly committed quite a few crimes during and after the financial crisis. So to me, this suggests that Biden is, we'll see about other issues. I still have a lot of concerns about Biden on big tech, but I think at least on the stuff the Obama administration screwed up really badly, he seems to understand, what to do about those.
It's interesting.
So Biden throughout his career has really hewed to this sort of like deficit hawk rhetoric. On the campaign trail, of course, we saw re-emerge these clips of him saying, I voted to cut Social Security and Medicare, and like going in on how like fiscally austere he was and what a responsible manager of the budget. Do you think that he still holds on to that view, or do you see an evolution in his perspective with regards to the deficit and the debt?
Certainly on the debt, I mean, the way that he has talked about his economic agenda, he said openly he thinks now is the time to invest multiple trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy, deficit be damned. So I think that is a clear change in approach for Biden compared to what he was doing in the 1980s and the 1990s. Part of that, I think, is probably driven by the intellectual consensus changing. I mean, the economics profession just doesn't look at debt deficits, even trade policy, the way it did 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's a lot of the critiques that the American left had been making of those policies have become pretty mainstream within the economics profession, even if the figures themselves are not people who are embraced by the political center. So I think Biden is moving with the sort of elite consensus on that point. I think so long as the elite consensus remains that deficits are okay and low interest rates are good, he's going to stick with that.
I completely agree with that. So what are the pitfalls of that? What are the pitfalls of going with the elite consensus, Zach?
Well, I mean, the elite consensus can change. I mean, I don't know if you guys were watching the debate over the $2,000 checks, but this became a really, key, not just progressive sort of sticking point in fiscal policy making, but the Democratic Party itself. I mean, you had Chuck Schumer and all of the Democratic leadership saying we're going to do $2,000 checks. It was the basic pitch for the Georgia runoff elections. Elect John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, and we'll give you $2,000. And which I think the pitch worked. I think it's a good pitch. But when that was happening, you had all of these sort of, bigwigs from the 1990s coming out, Larry Summers and Tom Friedman, and to a lesser extent, even Paul Krugman saying, whoa, these $2,000 checks, I don't know if this is a good idea, and giving all sorts of preposterous arguments as to why they were a bad idea. Now, I think they got beaten back by the political needs of the moment. I mean, the Democrats were already all in on this. But if the economics profession just decides to change its mind, just sort of shifts right again, then I think that the party eventually will follow them. So that's something to be worried about.
So, Zach, in terms of specific economic policy, you have kind of this weird situation where, of course, Biden had his policy papers on his website and whatever. He really didn't talk much about it on the campaign trail, though. It was really much more about this restore the soul of the nation pitch, which is why I was very skeptical he'd ultimately do anything, because typically presidents don't deliver on things they didn't promise on the campaign trail. It's not like, surprise, here's some amazing policy that I didn't tell you I was going to implement. But it actually looks like Biden may be heading somewhat in that direction. After the pressure on $2,000 checks, he came to the right place. We covered reports that Bernie Sanders is working on a stimulus package that could even include emergency universal health care as part of their pandemic stimulus. So what are some of the concrete actions that you expect Biden to take with executive orders, and what type of legislation do you think that he'll ultimately push?
I too have been really, really surprised by how aggressive he's been certainly on the fiscal policy front. I didn't expect to see him coming out for $2,000 checks, and I certainly didn't expect him to say, I want to have a multi-trillion-dollar fiscal agenda here. That just wasn't rhetoric that we saw in the campaign at all. There was no evidence that he was going to do this. But I see it as good news. I think you can do an awful lot with fiscal policy under reconciliation. Reconciliation is the Senate procedure where you pass legislation with a simple majority rather than with the 60-vote threshold needed under the filibuster. And so you can do all sorts of stuff. You can get aid to states out there. I think that's probably the most critical fiscal policy goal at the moment. I mean, we have about a $500 billion shortfall from state and local governments that's coming in. And if you don't get those governments that money, then treating the pandemic becomes really, really difficult, because governments have to cut jobs. And then who is going to do the public health work that is needed to deliver these vaccines and get the economy going again? So that's I think job number one. But job number two is we have an enormous shortfall of basic public investment in this country. Things like the $2,000 checks are great. I mean, I think they put money in people's pockets. They help you pay the bills. I mean, that's important stuff. But if you look at the way the U.S. economy has been structured over the past few decades, because there isn't a whole lot of public investment in basic things, whether it's national parks or even manufacturing policy, there isn't an incentive for private companies one by one to do big investments either. So the so-called innovations that we see in the private economy are things that economists call regulatory arbitrage. Something like Uber, which doesn't actually build anything, but finds a way to get around like taxi medallion laws so that it's like a little bit easier to get a cab. That's. I'm not a huge fan of Uber in general, but that type of innovation doesn't build anything, doesn't create a foundation for a more robust working class. And I think Biden needs to focus on the areas of the economy where we can use a lot of investment. And obviously, roads and bridges and basic infrastructure is one thing. But I think manufacturing policy. I mean, we just need to build things in the United States so that we can have good-paying manufacturing jobs here. And we saw at the beginning of the pandemic that the basic kind of trade arrangement that we have leaves the United States very, very vulnerable to shocks. Exogenous shocks are what economists call them, but just unexpected things happening. Suddenly you can't get stuff. We had nurses in trash bags at the beginning of this pandemic. I mean, that should have been disgraceful. And I think we have an opportunity using the pandemic as an example for people to say, look, we need to do these big economic changes in the country as part of sort of emergency relief.
Yeah, well, you're speaking my language, Zach. Appreciate you joining us, man. Thank you.
Great to see you, Zach.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Mm-hmm. Coming up, an FBI bulletin. It reveals the siege on the Capitol wasn't supposed to end there. It also seems all 50 state capitals will have some protests in the coming days. We're going to discuss what Rising continues.